Polish troops entered Kiev on May 7, 1920, and 4 months later, the Red Army was in Warsaw. The offensive that Jozef Pilsudski opened on April 25, driving east with Polish divisions and allied Ukrainian formations under Szymon Petliura, had looked at first like the boldest stroke of the post-war year. It did not hold. The city was abandoned by mid-June, and on June 5, Semyon Budyonny's 1st Cavalry Army had already torn open the Polish front near Samhorodok and Koziatin, turning an advance into a retreat that ran some 600 kilometers west. On July 4th, Mikhail Tukhachevsky launched his own offensive from the Berezina with the 4th, 15th, 3rd and 16th Armies and Gaya Guy's 3rd Cavalry Corps, and in 6 weeks the Western Front covered the distance from the Belarusian rivers to the outskirts of the Polish capital. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. At Białystok, on July 30th, a provisional Polish Revolutionary Committee was proclaimed under Julian Marchlewski, with Felix Dzierżyński, Felix Kohn and Józef Unszlicht beside him. It was a government in waiting for a capital that had not yet fallen. In Moscow, the Second Congress of the Communist International had met from July 19th to August 7th, with maps of the Red Army's advance posted in the hall, delegates watching arrows move west across Poland day by day. Lenin was explicit about what the advance meant. This was not a border war. It was revolution carried west on bayonets, and the destination was not Warsaw, but Berlin. Lord Curzon's note of July 11th had proposed an armistice along a demarcation line. The Soviet government rejected mediation and fought on. That decision would look very different depending on what happened on one narrow river south of Warsaw in the 3rd week of August, and on a warning that, in our history, arrived too late to matter. Pilsudski's answer to the collapse was not a defensive line. It was a gamble. Order No. 83583, issued on August 6, 1920, pulled 5 divisions out of a front that could barely spare them and assembled them behind the Wieprz River in the bridgeheads at Deblin and Puawy to be flung north into the gap between the Soviet Western and Southwestern fronts. It was an operation that depended entirely on that gap being empty. It very nearly was. Tukhachevsky was pushing his weight northwest toward the lower Vistula crossings, aiming to envelop Warsaw from above rather than storm it head-on. His southern shoulder rested on the Mozyr Group under Tikhon Kvezin, a few thousand men strung across a wide frontage, the sole Soviet screen between two fronts that were no longer in meaningful contact. Alexander Yegorov's southwestern front, with Stalin as political member of its military council, had been drawn off toward Lwow and did not release Budyonny's cavalry north, despite Sergei Kamenev's order of August 11. And the Poles knew. Since late 1919, cryptologists under Jan Kowalewski had been reading Red Army radio traffic. Tukhachevsky commanded from Minsk, far to the rear, by radio, and the Polish command could hear him doing it. The Battle of Warsaw opened on August 12 with heavy fighting at Radzymin. Władysław Sikorski's Fifth Army held the Dublikra to the north. Everything now turned on whether the man in Minsk would look south in time. In our timeline, he did not. In this one, on August 14th, air reconnaissance reports of Polish columns massing near Deblin and Puawy land on Tukhachevsky's desk in Minsk, alongside prisoner interrogations from the 16th Army's southern flank, saying the same thing. He believes them. The orders that follow are not dramatic. They are administrative, and that is precisely why they work. The Mozyr Group is halted in its northward drift and turned to face west along the Wieprz. The 16th Army's left wing is pulled back to lengthen the line and make contact with Gwizin's right. Engineers dig. Machine guns are sighted on the river crossings. It costs Tukhachevsky 2 days of momentum against the capital, and his staff protest the loss. On the morning of August 16th, the Polish strike group crosses the Wieprz and walks into prepared positions instead of open country. The difference is not that the Poles are outnumbered, they are not. The difference is that a maneuver designed to run unopposed into a vacuum has become a frontal assault against entrenched infantry. Pilsudski's plan had no second act. It was built on speed, and speed is the first thing taken from it. 4 days of fighting burn out the Polish reserve. The strike group gains ground. This is not a rout, and Kwezyn's men bleed for every kilometer, but it gains it slowly, and slowly is fatal. Every hour the strike group spends grinding north along the Wieprz is an hour it is not appearing behind the Soviet 16th Army, and an hour Sikorski's 5th Army fights alone on the WKRA with no relief coming from the south. North of the capital, Sikorski holds longer than anyone expects. He cannot hold indefinitely. On the eastern approaches, the Radzymin sector, which had changed hands repeatedly since the 12th, gives way for the last time, and by August 20 forward elements of the 16th Army reach the Praga suburb on the right bank of the Vistula, looking across the river at Warsaw. It is worth being clear about how narrow this is. In the recorded past, the counterstroke worked, and Tukhachevsky's front came apart within a week. The gap between that outcome and this one is 2 days of engineering work by a few thousand men. Nothing here was destined. That is the point. The Red Army enters Warsaw in the last week of August, and the Bialystok Committee is brought forward and installed as the government of a Polish-Soviet republic. Marchlowski signs proclamations. Dzierżynski organizes what he knows how to organize. Poland does not surrender. Pilsudski withdraws west and south rather than accept encirclement, and a rump command keeps fighting from Poznan and from the Krakow region, holding territory the Red Army is too extended to take quickly. Wincenty Witos, prime minister since July 24th, and his socialist deputy Ignacy Daszyński try to hold a civil state together from the west. But most of the diplomatic corps had already left the capital in mid-August, and the Entente now treats Poland as a lost position, rather than a partner to be resupplied. General Maxime Weygand and Lord d'Abernon, whose interallied mission had arrived in July and whose advice Polish commanders had resented, go home to explain a defeat neither of them commanded. The consequences of this would prove far larger than Poland. But to understand them, we have to look at the country the Red Army was actually marching toward. By October, Soviet columns stand on the Prussian and Silesian frontiers. They are exhausted, strung out along supply lines 700 kilometers deep. But they are there, and where they are is what matters. Germany in 1920 was not stable ground. The Kapp Putsch of March 13 to 17 had been broken by a general strike. The Ruhr Rising that followed had been crushed by Reichswehr and Freikorps in early April, and the Versailles Treaty capped Hans von Sachsen's army at 100,000 men. Germany had declared neutrality on July 20 and blocked arms transit to Poland. Danzig dock workers had refused to unload munitions, and Czechoslovakia had closed its railways to the same traffic. At Halle in October, the USPD splits, and its left majority moves toward merger with Paul Levi's KPD. In our history, that argument was about the Comintern's 21 conditions fought in the abstract. Here it is not abstract at all. It is about whether to rise now with an army calling itself the ally of the German worker standing at Posen and Thorn. And the German working class does not answer with one voice. Trade union leadership that had struck against Kapp in March has no appetite for a rising underwritten by foreign cavalry. Levi himself doubts it. Where risings come, they come unevenly, strongest in Saxony, Thuringia, and the eastern industrial districts, weakest in the Rhineland and the south. France answers before Germany finishes arguing. Alexandra Millerand's government mobilizes on the Rhine and moves troops beyond the occupied zone, and Ferdinand Foch's staff make the case plainly. A German collapse into revolution voids the entire settlement of 1919, reparations, disarmament, borders, and all. There is nothing left to enforce if there is nothing left to enforce it against. Britain will not follow. A Council of Action formed that summer still opposes intervention. Dockers refuse to load munitions, and a government that had already proposed mediation in July has no mandate to fight a war in Central Europe. The Entente that wrote the peace of 1919 divides over how to defend it, and the division is not a misunderstanding. It is two countries with genuinely different stakes reaching genuinely different conclusions. And then comes the moment that decides everything that follows, not a battle, but an accounting. Exhaustion decides more than victory does. Soviet supply lines run 700 kilometers back through a country entering its famine year, with rolling stock failing and grain requisition already tearing at the Soviet countryside. Lenin, who had pressed the westward advance hardest and who had heard Trotsky and Karl Radek doubt the timing all summer, is the one who has to count the wagons. The German rising is contained in the center and the west and is not contained in the east. France holds a line on the Rhine it has the strength to hold and not the political capital to advance beyond. So it is negotiated. Through 1921, in conferences nobody wants and everybody attends, Central Europe is partitioned along the lines the armies actually stopped on, a Soviet sphere reaching to the old Prussian border and beyond it in places, a western zone underwritten by French bayonets, and a Germany divided in fact before anyone agrees to call it that. None of this was foreseen by the men who made it, not by Lenin, who expected Berlin, not by Pilsudski, whose gamble had every reason to work and did work, once, in the timeline we actually inhabit. What separates the two is a warning believed instead of dismissed, and 2 days of digging on a small river in August. The settlement that Europe argued out over 19 more years and a second war arrives instead in 1921, unfinished and unloved, drawn by exhausted men who had run out of the strength to want anything more.